Chapter 32. The tempting scent of food woke Dani. She lay half asleep as she tried to work out just exactly what the aroma was. The invigorating tang of coffee was unmistakable, but the rest wasn't so easy. There was something spicy and something that smelled sweet. She frowned and sat up, pushing the blankets back as she went. Only when her feet hit the floor did she remember the night before, being carried to bed and asking Zach to stay. She'd been tired, and the alcohol, as little as it was, had gone to her head, doing its best to lower her inhibitions. And man, had it ever. She'd like to think she never would have asked Zach to stay if she hadn't been drinking, but she'd long ago sworn off lying to herself. It got her nowhere, and usually ended up leaving her disappointed. She had decided some time ago she was through making that mistake, so now she had to admit, at least to herself, how much she wanted Zach. Maybe it had been so long since she'd been with anyone, that she just needed to get laid and anyone would do. No, it simply wasn't true. She worked every day with Greg and spent a great deal more time with him than she had with Zach. If what she was feeling toward Zach was simply about sex, then she would have been drawn to Greg too, which she wasn't. No. Dani shook her head. It was Zach. She stood and went into the bathroom before going to see what the boys were up to now. Dani rolled her shoulders and yawned as she made her way from Zach's bedroom into the kitchen. There she found Zach in front of the stove, a wide spatula in one hand and a sizzling pan in front of him. Mark was on the other side of him, watching a steaming waffle iron on the counter in front of him. "What about now?" Mark asked, his eyes never leaving the device. "Not yet." Zach chuckled. "You need to be patient and let them crisp or you'll end up with soft waffles, and you know what that is?" "What?" "A pancake with holes." Dani stayed quiet and leaned one shoulder against the doorframe as she watched the interaction. It was interesting to say the least, to see the way Zach was patient and playful as he taught their boy to cook breakfast. Their boy. It struck Dani again how much Mark looked like his father. Thinking of fathers, it was about time Mark met Zach's parents. "Hi, Mom." Mark spotted her in the doorway. "We're making breakfast." "I see that." She glanced around the room, searching for the coffee, but not seeing it. "What are you after?" Zach asked. "Coffee." "Mugs are there, pots here." He lifted a blue speckled pot off the counter. Dani couldn't help the frown that formed as she shuffled to the cabinet and pulled down a cup. "What?" Zach asked, spotting her frown. "You're taking this cabin thing a bit too far." He frowned for a second, then realized what she was talking about. "Oh no. I just like percolator coffee. I can make it as light or as dark as I'm in the mood for, just by letting it boil a little longer." She blinked, not sure what to do with that. "Sugar." Zach pointed to a small sugar bowl on the far counter and went back to rolling sausage links in the skillet. "Go ahead and check those waffles, Mark," Zach said. When Dani brought her cup and stood next to the stove, Zach used a towel to pick up the coffee pot by the metal handle and filled it for her. "Have a seat. How do you like your eggs? Scrambled or fried?" She made her way to the table a few feet away, sat down, and watched the two of them move around each other, as if they had done it before. "Whichever you prefer." "Fried. Over medium. White solid runny yolk?" The lilt in Zach's words let her know it was a question, and she nodded before taking a sip. She closed her eyes and let sweetened yet still bitter flavor register as the caffeine hit her bloodstream. She was usually the one who got up early and made sure Mark had what he wanted and was well fed. It was nice to have breakfast put in front of her for a change. When her plate was put in front of her, she picked up the fork and found her eggs were cooked to perfection. The waffles were crispy and tasty without being drenched in syrup. And though she hadn't tasted it yet, The sausage looked just as good. Zach had learned to cook. "Wow," she said after her first few bites. "When did you learn to cook?" "In college." Zach shrugged. It was self-defense. The next plate was Mark's, and the boy came and sat beside her while Zach continued. "Sophomore year, I moved out of the dorms and shared an apartment with 2 other guys. After about a month, I was sick of takeout and ramen, so I started experimenting. I wanted something at least halfway decent, something that might remind me of home." "You just picked up a cookbook and got started?" "No." He gave a small laugh. "I called Mom a lot. I watched cooking shows on TV, and I made a lot of mistakes. But I learned, and now I'm a decent cook." The idea of him failing as he tried to cook made her smile. "What kind of mistakes?" "The first one that comes to mind is not knowing what self-rising flour is. Let me tell you, it's not interchangeable with all-purpose when making biscuits. Those things took forever to cook and were harder than rocks. We ended up playing street hockey with them. I was afraid someone was going to break a tooth if they tried to eat them." Dani shook her head and laughed. She could imagine. She'd not made that mistake, but she'd made plenty of her own while learning to cook. She'd learned that if there was any doubt between sugar and salt, taste it before adding it to the recipe. It wasn't so bad when it was a tablespoon or 2 in a bread recipe, but salt for sugar in a pie was disastrous. "Is that all?" she couldn't help but ask. She wanted to hear more about his misadventures as he learned to cook. "No, but it's the one that stands out the most. Nothing else was quite so big or funny." He served himself, brought his plate to the table, and sat across from her. "Just what I consider normal learning curve stuff. Burnt food or undercooked food, that kind of thing." Zach took a bite and looked over at Mark. "What do you think?" he asked after swallowing. "Es good," Mark said without a break and poking food into his mouth. "Number 1, don't talk with food in your mouth," Zach said before Dani had a chance. "And number 2, slow down. There's plenty of food, and you can have as much as your mom says is okay." Zach looked up at her, as if waiting for her to add more. "You can have more, but you don't need to eat Zach out of house and home in one meal." She looked at the boy with a slight frown. Recently, Mark had started eating more and more. It seemed like he was always eating. Probably because he was. She wasn't sure why, but she was worried something was wrong. She needed to schedule him an appointment to get seen, but she hadn't been in town long enough to figure out which doctor would be best. "No worries. I have plenty of food. I know what little boys are like." Zach shot her a smile. "I was about Mark's age when my mother swore I ate once a day. I started when I got up and didn't stop until I went to bed at night." Dani froze and looked across the table at him. If Zach had eaten like that too, maybe it wasn't something wrong with Mark. Maybe it was simply that boys ate more. "He's been eating a lot more lately. I've been trying to get him in to see a doctor. Are you saying it's normal?" "I'm afraid so." He glanced over at Mark, then looked back to her. "And it doesn't stop anytime soon." "How long did it last for you?" "About 15 years. He gave her a look that was half ducking, as if she was going to take a swing or throw something at him. "Sorry. Boys are weird. We burn a lot of calories, more if we're active, like playing sports or running a lot." Dani inwardly flinched. 10 or more years of this, from the sound of things, it was just the beginning. Mark's appetite was likely to get bigger before it got better. She would have to figure it out. One way or another, she'd make things work. She had to admit that Zach keeping Mark while she worked was a big help. It meant she didn't have to pay for his care, and Zach had been feeding him. It made her wonder how much Mark had been eating here because she knew, at least on the days she worked, she hadn't been feeding him much at home, but she wasn't sure how to ask or how to offer to help with the food bill. You've been feeding us a lot recently, your grocery bill has to have skyrocketed. Maybe this would work. She felt a little guilty that it hadn't occurred to her sooner about how much he had to be spending. I don't mind. He smiled, and Dani knew that look. It meant that he'd made up his mind about something, and she wouldn't be able to budge him on it. She'd only encountered it a few times, but it was a look she would never forget. If you say so. She let it go. Now, in front of Mark, wasn't the time to fight about it. What do you have planned for today? Zach asked as he cut a couple bite-sized pieces off his waffle. I have some chores I need to get done. Laundry, grocery shopping, that kind of thing. Why? I was hoping you'd let me help you, then maybe we could take someone? He looked at Mark from the corner of his eye, then back to her. To meet my parents. Your parents? Excitement was plain in Mark's voice. More grandparents? He looked back and forth from her to Zach and back. Are they like grandpa or grandma? Zach frowned. What do you mean? They're more like grandma, baby, Dani said. I've not seen Zach's dad in a long time. It would be nice to go see them. Where are they today? It's Wednesday, they should be home. If I remember right, Ashley's covering the store today. What about the pumps? Dani asked. We only keep an extra person on them, on weekends and holidays, when the lake is busier. Dad should be at home with Mom. She bit the inside of her lip, not sure if she should ask. I'd like to see your parents, to go with you if you don't mind. She wasn't sure if he'd welcome having her along, but it had been way too long since she'd seen the man she'd named their son after, and she hoped Zach would agree to her going. I planned on it. I wouldn't leave you behind for something like this. It's part of why we didn't go yesterday. She was unable to keep the tears from her eyes, so Dani looked down at her plate so neither of the boys would notice them. She was touched that he'd thought about her feelings, and had waited for her to be able to go before taking his son to meet his folks. Why don't you call and make sure they'll be home while Mark and I go home and put on clean clothes? She finished her breakfast and pushed the plate away. She would take it to the sink in a minute. We can go over whenever they're ready. It's still early. Mark stood, picked up her plate, and carried it to the counter. More, Mom? No, I'm good. I'll call, but I don't think they have anything planned. They usually let me know, in case there's trouble at the store. What time do you think you'll be ready? He glanced at the clock over the stove, making Dani wonder what time it was. She hadn't looked after getting up. Wow. It was almost 10. She'd slept later than she had in weeks. No wonder she felt so good. How about we leave at 11:30, is that enough time? Dani turned back to look at him, blinking a moment, until she remembered what they'd been talking about. Going to see his parents. That should be good. She glanced at Mark. But it means we need to head home so we can get ready. Mom. I'm not through eating. You need a shower and clean clothes. If it's okay with you, he can shower here. I have clean clothes for him. You can go home and take your time, I'll get him ready, and then we can pick you up. She thought about it a second. The chance to take her time, and not have to worry about making sure Mark was ready, it was almost too good to be true. You got it. She stood. I'll go change before I go. She should wear her own clothes home, though she was loath to give up the shirt that smelled like him. She'd noticed when she'd put it on the night before how his scent hadn't changed in all these years. He still wore the same deodorant and cologne he'd worn in high school. It made her smile then and still did now. She knew the sweater of his she'd taken with her when her family had moved was still in the back of her closet, his scent long gone, but for some reason she'd been unable to get rid of it. Why? Just wear those home. I've got plenty. Are you sure? Dani knew and suspected Zach did too, that if she wore them home there was little chance he'd get them back. Well, he might, but only if she got to exchange them for something else once his tempting scent had faded. She knew she was a bit old for things like that, but she didn't care. I'm sure. Take them. Take anything from my closet you'd like. There was something in his eyes she wasn't ready for. She looked away, wondering where she'd set her purse and keys. What his eyes hinted at was something more permanent, and she didn't know if she could handle that. Not yet. It was too soon. It had only been a few weeks. And they'd barely kissed. What if they weren't compatible anymore? What if he decided he didn't want to suddenly be dad to a 9-year-old? What if things didn't work out? She didn't want to rush into anything. There was too much at stake. There next to the door. Zach seemed to know just what she needed, even when she didn't. Thank you. She bent and kissed the top of Mark's head. You behave and do what your father says. I'll see you in a bit. Your father. That felt weird. She looked up at Zach, he nodded. She didn't know what more to say, so she turned and grabbed her things on the way out to the truck. She needed to shower, and standing there mooning over Zach or thinking what might be, what could be, was only wasting time. Dani fell onto the couch with a sigh. Her body ached, and she would swear that every cell was exhausted. She should be in the shower getting ready for her date with Zach, but she'd been called in to cover for someone who had called in sick, and she needed a few minutes to relax first. It had been a week since they'd taken Mark to meet his grandparents. That had gone amazingly well. Zach had taken him back several times, and tonight they were keeping Mark overnight so Zach could take Dani out, their first real date in years. Dani had hesitated when he'd first asked, but when his parents had offered to keep Mark, she decided why not. Since then she'd looked forward to it, now she dreaded getting ready, going out and pretending she wasn't completely drained. Staring up at the ceiling, she considered calling Zach and rescheduling, but she was sure he had already dropped Mark off, and she hated to do that to him. Still, going out and pretending wouldn't be fun for either of them. She pulled out her phone and held it up enough to see it, so she could dial him. As soon as it started ringing, she hit the button for the speakerphone. Hey, I hope you've had a great day and are getting ready for tonight. Zach's voice was bright and cheerful coming over the line. That's kind of what I'm calling about. She didn't know how to tell him, she just wasn't up to going out. You sound tired, what's up? His tone immediately changed and filled with concern. I got called in this morning? I would have called sooner, but it was insane. We didn't even have time to eat. You don't want to see me. That's not it. Not at all. I want to see you, but I'm exhausted. I just don't have it in me to get ready and go out to play on the lake. So let's not. He made it sound so simple. Have you eaten yet? No. I made it through the door and collapsed onto the couch. I haven't even thought about cooking yet. Then don't. I'll stop and get food. You get comfortable and rest, I'll be there in, he paused, somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. How's that sound? Amazing. Now I just have to muster enough energy to go shower. A low chuckle rumbled over the phone. Or you could wait until I'm there to help you with that. Sparks of desire ran through her at the idea of him in the shower with her. It was something she'd imagined, but they'd never had the opportunity to try. Something she'd never been brave enough to do with a stranger since then. Maybe I will. She let him think about that for a few seconds, then spoke again. I'll leave the door unlocked. You can just come on in, just in case I'm in the shower when you get here. That's an offer I'm not sure I can resist. I'll get dinner and be there as soon as I can. See you then. She disconnected the call and let the phone and her hand fall against the cushion beside her. The idea of hot water almost roused her, until she realized she'd have to stand under the spray. Then it hit her, she was the only one in the house, there was nothing she had to get done, no one to wait on or to watch, she could take a bath instead. Dani stood, ignoring the screaming of her feet and calves as she gingerly stepped down the hall to the bedroom, where she kicked off her shoes and stripped out of her uniform. Barefoot and naked, she eased into the bathroom and turned on the water. After a moment's hesitation, she reached under the sink, grabbed a large bag of Epsom salts, and dumped a generous heap into the tub. That done, she dug out some of the half-forgotten bubble bath from the same cabinet and poured some in. The scent of honeysuckle filled the room, as she made sure there were towels nearby before stepping into the steaming water. When the water was an inch shy of the rim, she leaned forward enough to shut it off, then eased back and closed her eyes. She would just stay a few minutes. Just long enough for the water to ease the aches and soreness.